Okay, so good afternoon and welcome to Sumpoorn MSME Conversations. This month, we're looking at MSMEs through the lens of manufacturing. Last month, we'd done a deep dive into the export sector. So this time, we're really happy to have with us Srivats Ram, who's the MD of Wheels India, to help unpack all this for us. Also with me is Narsi, who is Principal Advisor and Mentor for Jakarta. He was earlier Group CEO, Dun & Bradstreet, oversight of South Asia, Middle East and Africa. And he has very strong expertise in managing all these global information services, credit bureaus and setting up rating companies. To give a small introduction to what we do in Sumpoorn, it's an index which tracks the sales activity of MSMEs. We have data since October 2019 and we've seen that this past year, it's been doing better than it was the previous year. August actually slowed down, typically slows down a little bit to 0.57. July it was 0.59. August, to make a comparison, the index was at 0.56. Basically, we've seen that sales activity has been in a zone of mild expansion over the past year, and we can call this resilience on one hand. But I think we're all still looking for some spurt in the pace of growth and kind of wondering where it could possibly be coming from. Before we begin, I just want a couple of macro points. RBI has just raised the GDP outlook for the year to 6.8%, and they've said with risks evenly balanced, which is good. But we all know that for small businesses, they're way more vulnerable to risks and uncertainties than larger firms. So that's on the larger side. But we've also had the RBI Industry Outlook Survey that came out on the 1st, and that showed for Q2 a lower assessment for demand conditions compared to Q1. This was production, order books and everything. So everybody's optimistic, but we're just trying to, get a feel of what the ground reality really is. So with this backdrop, I would like to begin by asking Srivats, can you tell us, what do you think your outlook is for India's manufacturing sector overall, next 6 months or so? What do you think are the biggest problems or risks?
Thanks, Sumita. Couple of points. One is, when we look at outlook, it is always a relative measure. If I compare with what I probably thought the outlook would have been in March for the year, despite the fact that we've had, quite a lot of, chaos on the international side of business with the Trump tariffs and all the uncertainty related to that, I think the GST rate reduction has definitely helped sentiment. And sentiment, as the stock market always says, it reflects probably more of a forward expectation as opposed to even the immediate past. Now, when you look at the immediate past and you looked at Q2, you are right that overall Q2 has been fairly damp by industry standards. Some of it is expected because on two fronts. One is during the monsoon season, generally sales in certain categories tends to be low. For example, construction equipment does not move at any pace at all when it is pouring, cats and dogs. So to that extent, there is a certain element of slowing down of economy during the monsoons. Secondly, I think that while the government has taken a very bold and a very positive step in terms of reducing GST rates, they announced it about a month in advance. So to that extent, there is a certain amount of people holding back on purchases because they felt that post September 22nd, they would get a much lower rate or price, a landed cost for them. And I don't know to what extent between the 22nd and the 30th they could have completed whatever was pending from August and September. So there might be a little bit of spillover into October. So it is a fact that by and large for companies, it has been a very muted Q2. But that said, the prospects, and again, prospects are a very funny thing because it's not exactly what you see immediately in front of you in October, because if I look at October is not great largely because of number of working days. You have Puja holidays, you have Gandhi Jayanti, you have Diwali, you have everything packed in 1 month. So the number of working days is less. So with respect to that, sales cannot be tremendously more. But at the same time, if we look at some of the effects, I come from the automotive industry, so let me talk about that. Post monsoon, there is usually some improvement in infrastructure activities because infrastructure activities cannot happen when there's heavy rain. So infrastructure activities should improve. So to a certain degree, the truck industry should improve in the third quarter compared to the second quarter. On passenger cars and two-wheelers, of course, there's been a significant reduction. These are more price-sensitive parts of the automotive market, and at the lower end of the market where there's a benefit, there should definitely be growth going forward. The tractor segment similarly should benefit from a lower GST. So all these are positive. Let me just go back a little bit and look at the various measures that the government has indicated from the beginning of the year, starting with the budget. So the budget, for example, had this 1 lakh crore income tax benefit just by raising the minimum levels. That, however, did not exactly translate into increase in consumption. In my limited knowledge on the subject, two reasons for that potentially could be one, that at the lower level of income, there are companies who adjusted the pay to workmen so that the salary received by them remained the same and there wasn't really a pass on. And the second thing is that actually there was a fair build-up of household debt, which is probably serviced by the fact that people got more money in their hands. It would have helped them, enable them to better service their debt. So that actually didn't result in any great increase in consumption, whereas this is a more consumption-oriented tax, and it gives a sense to people that things will improve, demand will improve. In some segments, no doubt it will improve. In some segments, it may be limited. I would probably say that this is the reason why the RBI has actually upped their expectation for GDP for the year. The second thing is that if you look at the export markets, and I know you've covered it earlier, but the sentiment that I got an opportunity to travel in Tamil Nadu fairly extensively in the last year to at least 9 of the districts or zones that CII is involved in, and I got to interact with a lot of people. And before this interview, I also touched base with a couple of them just to find out where they were. Now, broadly in the MSME segment, people are positive, and when you compare it with last year, there has been an improvement even in the international sales or exports that they have. However, those who were probably significantly exporting to the United States have been affected in textile garments. Places like Tirupur, for example, they have been affected where they are more US centric, and there are some companies, some of the large global companies, who can flip at a switch. Okay, you're not competitive, we got another person, bring them in. On the engineering segment, it's a bit tougher because normally you need to validate, test a product, introduce it. There's a longer lead time. So I would say that while exports per se have been affected in some of the more labor intensive segments, which are more of the MSME category, which are like textile garments, leather and footwear, for example, and gem and jewelries, which is there in a limited extent in Coimbatore, in your area. Outside of that, I think the engineering sector has not so far been hit. They might have been hit by probably sharing of some of the burden, price reduction, but not so much in terms of demand, and which is not likely to change in the immediate future provided this 50% tariff comes down. At a 25% tariff, people can manage, but at 50%, it doesn't really work. There is also an expectation, even with the government, and even the chief economic advisor mentioned it, that they hope that they can come to some resolution with the United States before the end of the year at the very least. So if that happens, then I think that would weigh in with the RBI's expectation of GDP growth. But there is uncertainty, and uncertainty at the very least does make people a bit reluctant to put in capital in the large amounts that the government expects.
Let me ask some very specific questions. The best man to answer that is here with us. Just before I ask the question, I want to do a quick sum up as to where I am coming from. Very recently, the government of India just put out study on the auto component industry as early as just April 2025. And there has been a very interesting set of facts that have been presented as to the state of the auto sector and the auto component industry. And I would like to recall a very recent interview that you have also given, which I had the pleasure of watching on the YouTube to one of the business media houses as to the prognosis for the industry going forward. You had happened to mention that unlike the textile sector, which is highly employment intensive, the auto sector isn't as much so. That was one of the important points that you had made, and I started looking at it from the perspective of looking at the two, and also from the lens of manufacturing activity and the contribution to the GDP. So when I looked at the two sectors, the textile sector roughly contributes about 2.3% to the GDP, whereas the auto sector is 7.1%. The textile sector with the direct and indirect employment is close to 100 million people. When I look at the auto sector, the direct employment is roughly in the order of 4.5 million people and 26 million people indirect, so 30 million. So when you look at it, it's so lopsided, but yet the value addition from the auto sector is substantial. And coming to your own sector, which is auto components, that employs nearly 1.5 million people directly. And I do not know the indirect. So in that context, when GST 2.0 has happened, where do you see the sector itself heading from an employability/employment creation perspective? Number two, from the perspective of spurring personal consumption in vehicles, be they passenger vehicles, two-wheelers, or the larger commercial vehicles, because these are all the triggers to industrial activity and also personal consumption, which is a huge driver of credit. So I would love you to kind of split this open into these two parts and help us understand where we are headed.
So Nazamun, I think it's a very keen observation that you've made, distinguishing the automotive sector with the textile sector. Automotive sector is more capital intensive. So to that extent, the labor involvement is much less and it's less labor intensive as a broad segment vis-a-vis the textile segment. Of course, there are degrees of labor intensity even within the automotive industry. So to that extent, when the capital labor ratio is more mixed this way, your contributions also change. This is one thing. The other thing is that if you actually look at employment, the challenge that India has had and the automotive industry has had to a great extent in the recent past has been that the growth has not been substantive. So when the growth is not substantial, you can't expect, and when capacity utilizations are not at the brink, it's very difficult to expect people A to put in capital, and B, it's very difficult to expect them to employ more people. And actually, to the contrary, in the automotive industry, there's always a certain amount of downward pressure on your prices. So you end up having to do productivity improvements, which may actually work counter to the employment generation side of it. So we need a certain amount of growth to kind of balance where they end up being net additions. So this is one observation that I wanted to leave you with. Secondly, I think the way the GST 2 has been structured would tend to lean more towards that is less than 4 meter car and less than and the two-wheeler segment, and maybe to some extent the tractor segment. I think in the two-wheeler segment and the passenger car segment, definitely there should be some amount of retail growth, definitely during the festival season, but how much of it hangs over after the festival season, we have to see. Still, the expectation is that it will give a little bit of a push even post Diwali. Some of the other segments, the tractor segment, no doubt it will help reduce the cost to farmers, but that segment has had a reasonable year and has had growth. How much further extent the growth will actually happen, we have to see. The commercial vehicle segment will also benefit, but again, it depends more on the infrastructure as opposed. People don't, in the case of tractors and commercial vehicles, these are commercial decisions based on forward prospects that you have and prices and things like that, as opposed to I can afford so much. Somebody just doesn't buy 3 tractors instead of 2 tractors because he has cash on hand. So we have to see how that actually translates. But definitely on the retail side of it, I think there will be growth. But this time I feel will also result in employment. While we're talking about employment, let me also again go back to the MSME export sector, which is dependent on the US. I think they will find it very difficult to hold on to people, and I think they're in a situation where they will probably need to reduce their employment, because the longer this takes, the harder it is for them to continue to hold people. Again, if this US discussion does get settled, it will be harder for them to get them back. But at the same time, some of them are bleeding, and I think it'd be good if some support can be given.
That makes tremendous sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
We still haven't seen anything specific coming from the government, have we? For the MSMEs, especially from the export side, also nothing.
No, they've broadly reflected the fact that they recognize that there is pain, and they recognize the fact that maybe something should be done, but they have been less explicit in terms of what specifically they could do.
Right.
Because obviously, industry has raised it. I think larger companies, despite the fact that they are also affected, have at least, the scale or resilience, depending on which way you look at it, managing this. But for smaller companies, it's a more dire circumstance if you allow things to prolong for too long. And I think that the larger companies have some kind of strategy in place. The smaller companies, I think, need support. Prior to the Trump tariffs and all that, cash flow was extremely tight in the MSME sector. I mean, it started probably, last year from July onwards, but the situation has not actually eased off. So it's a tight situation in the sense that MSMEs do complain either about the fact that the rates that they have to pay are high. And I know SIDBI is doing a lot of stuff there as well. And it's also a question of awareness to some extent. But they are finding themselves very cash strapped at the current moment. So I think some way of easing that, of enabling financing at least towards export oriented MSMEs would be helpful. Again, some kind of scheme to MSMEs wherein they can retain their employees for a limited period of time, maybe just for 1 or 2 months. These schemes may not be too expensive for the government, because it's, again, at least on the employment side, I'm assuming it would be a limited period. But these type of things, and also they can limit it to MSMEs, and instead of looking at the broader spectrum, these would be probably helpful.
So coming back to the auto sector again, one of the things that the government has clearly expressed in terms of the objective is to see, very specific to the auto component sector, production moving from circa 60 billion to 145 billion by 2030. Now, if that were to happen, and if that has to happen, naturally large investments by all the auto component manufacturers in capacity creation should be a must, unless there is so much unused capacity that's available amongst the OEM producers as such. And also the goal to have a much higher export share in the global value chain from the present 3% to at least 8 to 9%, which means, again, you're talking about a doubling or tripling of the market share. Don't you think that the auto sector is very well positioned to get to realize this ambition of higher value creation, larger ability to play a much more pivotal role in spurring the exports? Because I also read that the component industry is very trade neutral at 0.99, which means you're virtually importing the value of your exports, and the goal is to change it into a trade surplus of at least 25 billion. With all this put together, and the fact that auto is at the center of tremendous value creation from a manufacturing perspective, what do you see as the future?
For the automotive sector, honestly, the domestic market is much more significant. We do export about a quarter or more of produce to other countries, but majority of it, if you look at the entire industry, is largely domestic. So domestic market growth will definitely help, and India should grow at some degree, at least at a 6+ rate of growth, if not higher than that. going forward, and that will definitely spur demand and should bring in investments. And this is also being part of the plan of some of the larger manufacturers, vehicle manufacturers, for example, in the country, who announced new plans and new expansion plans. And component sector will have to also invest in capacity to adapt to that increase in their customer demand. Now, if you look at the export market, broadly speaking, you have who are the large people who would actually import components. You have the United States, Europe, China. Perhaps these are three big markets. China essentially not competitive, so you're not going to be able to get it. In the US, you have a 25% duty vis-a-vis other countries like Thailand and Indonesia, who are potentially competitors, who are at 19% rate of duty, or Europe, which is at 15% for the US. So effectively, your existing business is not affected, but your future competitiveness, you're at a slight disadvantage vis-a-vis countries like Thailand and Indonesia. So it's not an unmanageable situation, but if you have, if the government is looking at bright prospects, at least level playing field vis-a-vis your competition, not even China, but more of the neighboring countries or similar type of countries is what would probably help spur the growth. More than that, also as far as the US is concerned, some stability in terms of this is what it is going to be for the next 3 years. And I know the Indian government can't promise something that the US government themselves don't know.
But then in the context of that, Srivats, what do you think is that magic bullet, so to say, to help improve the prospects of the auto sector and auto component sector? Why am I harping on it is simply because of the very large share of the manufacturing GDP that it still occupies. 49% of India's manufacturing GDP, which is between 13-18%, is occupied by auto sector. So in so many ways, it is touching the lives of everyone, right, who are employed there, whose families, and then all the value chain around all other suppliers to the industry as such. Everything is touched by them. So what is that? GST 2.0 seems to have delivered a lot, right? Already there is not much of an inverted rate structure, except perhaps I do not know if still some raw material components or inputs carry a higher duty structure compared to the output, especially in tractors is the only thing I see. Everything else has been rationalized to the same 18%.
Yeah, they know
what will change?
No major issues. So again, I mean, US, I think stability in terms of this is what it is. See, for people to make investment, they need to have a certain degree of certainty. Uncertainty is the biggest enemy of making investment decisions, which are normally done looking at the next 3 to 5 years type of scenario. I think some degree of stability or some signal towards this is what it is going to be would be useful. A level playing field, of course, would help. We also have to bear in mind that Europe, which is the other major party that India is trying to work out a free trade agreement with, as we speak, is also kind of lining up CBAM as a potential, alternate to what Trump did in the US, although probably more sophisticated, but essentially it's another form of trade barrier that they are looking at. So I think India's ability to navigate these are very important if our export potential is to be truly, realized. And of course, India has done, for example, two-wheeler manufacturers have been very successful exporting to Africa, Latin America, even Southeast Asia. But for the component manufacturers, the big markets are US and Europe, and the extent to which we are able to manage trade agreements or at least a stable environment with these two countries is very important. Even now, with all the duties and the oil surcharges which are being placed upon our country, there are a lot of manufacturers who are looking at India and who, as a matter of fact, are saying, let's wait till the end of the year, let's see what happens. And then depending on that, we'll relook at it. There is a certain amount of, because I've been dealing with some of these multinational companies and their global purchasing offices for 20 odd years at least, I see a better positioning of India. They look at India as a credible supply source. However, if you differentiate India with China from a geopolitical angle, they would like to maybe limit at least from a de-risking angle, because it's significantly exposed. India is relatively small, so the opportunity for India to increase our stake in these markets is large. But I think in the US, at least, what I'm hearing from customers is let's wait and watch and see what happens before the end of the year, and then either things settle down and we can do something. There was a time period where they were asking some of the component industry, can you look at alternate locations to supply from? There is a need for supply chain both in Europe and US because the labor skill level available is relatively low. And that's kind of where China completely plugged in. And India is reasonably well placed to manage that whole situation, provided there is a kind of a stable environment. And I know it is easy to say that, and it's not a single person who's going to decide all this. But from an investment viewpoint, this is what you would look at. The other thing is that there are a lot of opportunities which are auto component sector, also partly due to multiple energy sources for the automotive industry. Obviously, there's the ICE engine, which is petrol, diesel, CNG, electric. All these expand the market a little bit, increase what is the supply content that can go into the market. So there's enough that's kind of happening probably in the domestic market, especially now that GST is done. Export is the only side which has, hopefully we can navigate the current, uncertainty and come out of it. Then we should be okay.
Given the fact that the component industry also is very geared towards domestic, right? 70% domestic, 30% exports is the typical number that has been there globally. And that being the case in India as well, definitely you would be more concerned about the way the domestic demand is going to shape in the immediate future and going forward post the GST 2.0. And how do you see the manufacturing from a domestic perspective scaling up? While the tariff issues are outside of our control, but nevertheless catering to the domestic demand, and how do you see this panning out? Because that has a very strong bearing on credit offtake, which is a huge driver of the entire consumption story and the banking sector, and therefore employment all around.
The government has introduced a couple of schemes, nothing new, but the PLS scheme and the Atmanirbhar scheme working in conjunction with each other definitely is something where the government is encouraging localization of technology and localization of manufacturing of value add in the country, and that definitely will also probably result in the rebalancing between export and import that we've seen. The other area where this will come about is once India gets closer to, we have already made a big gap reduction in terms of technology in India vis-a-vis technology in these other countries, but once we are able to narrow that a little bit more, then you get enough scale in the domestic industry where you can pretty much do everything. The only other area that probably requires some assistance where the automotive scale itself is not enough is in the case of semiconductors and chips, which I believe the government has taken some steps. It probably will be, maybe a decade at least before things really start and India reaps the benefit of that. But I think some steps and some focus has been there from the government on ensuring that participant.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, most of our expectation is from the central government. What's the role of the state government? And from the point of view of Tamil Nadu, is there something that they've done or they have specific for your ecosystem?
The government has been reasonably proactive in Tamil Nadu in 2 or 3 ways. One is there's been a lot of outreach programs that they've had, be it with places like Japan or Taiwan or Germany or US or UK. Even the Chief Minister has traveled to all these places and they have brought in FTI, or at least brought in commitments of FTI. And in Tamil Nadu, a lot of it has also fructified into agreements and some investment which has come in. So I think the government's part as far as industry is concerned, of course, is to attract new industry, but also basically to ensure the infrastructure is put in place and ease of doing business, which much maligned term that we have in India.
Right.
The ease of doing business is there. See, the concern that I have with the ease of doing business is that in India, unfortunately, the larger you are as a company, the easier it is for you to do business. And as you are smaller, it becomes a lot harder for you to do what you would take for granted if you were a larger company. And I've had a unique opportunity of being in both, running a large company and also also simultaneously running a small company. And even though you're kind of, you're the same person that deals with sometimes the same bank, their expectations of smaller companies or companies that are starting up are very, very unreasonable. They expect companies to come up with a business plan, and very much like an expansion in a company where they say, okay, I have an existing business of some scale, I'm putting in an investment, let's say of 100 crores, and this is my business plan. Banks look at, new companies or MSMEs from the same angle, whereas very often if there's slight variation from that, they become much tighter on them. So I think that despite various efforts by the government, and Tamil Nadu has also been reasonably successful in the recent past with startups, but MSMEs by and large find it harder to access capital, both from a working capital viewpoint, which is still a pain point for industry, but also in terms of scaling, it is a bit of a challenge for them to be able to access funds and to scale.
That will probably bring me to the next question, and thanks for bringing this point. So when you're talking about access to finance for MSMEs, and you all acknowledge that there is a bit of a challenge for all of them to be able to raise finance in the same manner as a large company would find it easier to, two hands to clap. If the auto sector has to grow and create capacity, including everybody like you who are the giants, right, who are creating capacities, how are you working to create an ecosystem of suppliers to you who are in a better position to be able to access credit by the virtue of the fact that they are dealing with very pedigreed OEMs such as you in the entire ecosystem, and probably within the state, because I think the industry has a lot of clustering that we notice, in which case is there such an initiative to help MSMEs rise up to this opportunity and harness this, in a meaningful way?
I think from a working capital viewpoint, by and large, I think the norms, which is if you delay payments for MSMEs, you have to report it
45 days,
Yeah, that 45-day thing has worked. It's had its pluses and minuses in various degrees, because the MSMEs who also lend to MSMEs, so to that extent, MSMEs who buy from smaller MSME suppliers have been affected. But by and large, I think this has been quite effective. Where it probably has not been effective is, unfortunately, sometimes when they deal with government agencies, but I'm not sure whether they get their money always. And so where people have more exposure to the government, or if they have more international exposure and then they get affected by sudden shocks in demand, that's kind of where they get affected on the working capital side. On the raising fresh capital, again, much as a large company would be reluctant to put in huge amounts of money at a time of uncertainty, it is doubly, important for an MSME to be careful, because for them the percentage of capital addition is much more significant as a percentage of the amount of capital that they have as a company as a whole. So it's a bigger risk in a way for them to expand, because normally their expansion is a bigger percentage of their existing business. So for them, expansion is a bigger risk, and a more stable environment would definitely help. We can't hope to have a stable global economy in all respects, and it's definitely not within the control of even the government of India. But these factors do kind of help enable people to take decisions.
Understood. And
I'm sorry, Nasmat. Just one more point.
Sorry.
There's also a lot of opportunity for, component manufacturers to look at a wider set of customers, perhaps. For example, while they are focused on auto, there may be people in the industrial sector who use similar components. So broad basing your customer base will also probably help to some extent. And I think the government is also trying to push towards more localization in some of the not immediately auto, but allied kind of industry segments. So that's probably an opportunity which is there for some of the MSMEs.
I really want to thank you a lot for this, Srivats, because it's been mostly positive. I mean, I don't know, your economist dismal hat does not seem to be around too much. So that's great. It's like a very positive outlook.
Yeah, Sumita always has been talking about...
No, it's me.
See, the only thing is Sumita has been very concerned about the monsoon impact, the fury of it, and she's also written a piece about the risks that we have seen in temporary demand destruction in many of those places. While the rest of the region seem to have benefited with better monsoons, nevertheless, nature has been overkind in some of the places, and that has caused definite disruptions. which we have to acknowledge.
Yeah,
The other
Punjab, I
main
think
thing
Punjab,
is
or maybe
before,
Haryana, that part of.
yeah,
Punjab,
exactly.
Himachal, Uttarakhand,
Marathwada
Maharashtra. Right. Marathwada is in a very bad shape right now. I mean, we are like
is not in great
drought
shape.
areas
So,
actually flooded completely.
so
Yeah.
that's also a very challenging situation that we seem to be faced with. And as you rightly pointed out, Srivats, the September seems to have been rather robust for the entire auto sector. Every number that I have seen, I'm just staring at them. Royal Enfield shows 43% YOY growth. Skoda has shown 101% growth, and everybody else is showing 9%. Yeah, 9% to 10% seems to be the norm of the YOY growth on a September numbers. How much of it would sustain beyond this particular month? Deepavali month, I think, has to be robust is one positive sentiment that we can go with, I hope. But after that, of course, the Christmas is upon us, and probably the season does seem to hold positive cues. I mean, I do not know if you would be as optimistic as I, but I would love to hear that as a parting remark.
Yeah, I think the only thing about forecasting is, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's if you're optimistic, then probably something is going to come that will pull you down. If you're too pessimistic, something will come that will perk you up. There's no right way to do it. I'll just put it this way, that probably before the GST cut, I would have said that, our growth could even potentially have been a sub 6 growth, and the GST has definitely pushed it above the 6% mark, and this is again a conservative view. And I think that definitely the Deepavali season will be good, and November to March we have to see how things shape up, but we don't expect any major surprises, and things should be positive going forward.
So I guess all the banks and non-banking financial companies should feel very comforted about these words, that their loan book is going to look up insofar as it concerns the auto loans.
Hopefully.
We can hope so. We can hope so.
Glad to hear that.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks so much,
Thank you so
Srivats.
much.
Thank you.